There are lots of people who make a difference in small ways and big ways. Our guest today on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino put down on paper the 100 greatest people of the 20th century. Let's see how many of these advocates for social justice we can discuss in the next 30 minutes. Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, Harvey Milk, Malcolm X, Gloria Steinem, Ted Kennedy, and Bella Abzug are just 7 of the 100 greatest people of the 20th century, according to author and professor Peter Dreier. Let's hear why and get to know more of these great leaders for social justice from the E.P. Clapp Distinguished Professor of Politics and the Director of the Urban and Environmental Policy Department at Occidental College. Welcome, Peter Dreier. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here.
This is a fantastic book, and I know you put your heart and soul and your own political passion into social justice. So I figured this is like 100 mini Peter Dreiers on the page. But who's your favorite of the 100 in here?
Well, you're right. It was a labor of love, and it was hard to pick the 100 because there are a lot of people in American history.
Yeah, we're going to get to the people you left out because I want to hear about that too.
Okay, but I think of all the people, my favorite is probably Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther
King. It was such because he was around when I was growing up, and he was an inspiring public figure. And even today, I teach a lot of stuff about Martin Luther King in my classes because he understood that as a country we had a great tradition. He always drew on the Constitution. He always drew on the Bible. He was somebody who understood how to link the past and the present and lead us into the future. And he made some very bold choices in his life that put himself at both physical danger and also ultimately led to his assassination. But He was a man of great courage, and we're still living with his legacy of social justice. If he were alive today, he'd be right in the middle of all the great things that are happening on the ground here in the Los Angeles area and around the country.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key distinction of why your book is different than just a history book that tells what happened, is you're really talking about 100 people who each had their own movement, and that movement had a legacy in and of itself. It's not about a battle. It's not about a World War II. It's about what drove the movements of the 20th century, and I think that's why this is fascinating, and to a certain extent that's what you do today as an activist yourself, is you're behind several movements, and so I see the inspiration here. But let's sort of, obviously, we're both New Jersey kids, and so seeing Bruce Springsteen in the 100, that's sort of cool, that the boss would be right alongside Roosevelt and Martin Luther King. What was your affinity to Bruce Springsteen, and why is he in the 100 greatest Americans of the 20th century?
Well, there are 3 kinds of people in the book. There are activists and organizers, people like Dr. King and people like Eugene Debs and people like Walter Reuther, the great labor leader, and Betty Friedan, the great feminist organizer. And then there were politicians, people who ran for office,
politicians.
Who were elected for office, senators, presidents, congresspeople, Mayor Philo LaGuardia from New York.
We'll get to the little flower in a little while.
He's a hero of yours. And then there were thinkers and artists and writers, people like Upton Sinclair and people like Paul Robeson and Pete Seeger, and theologians and people like that. And Bruce Springsteen falls into that last category. He inspires people with his music. Every time he gives a concert, he talks about the local charities and organizing groups wherever he's giving a concert. I saw him in Boston a few years ago, and he was talking about some of the work that was going on in Boston around housing and gentrification and helping the veterans of America. And because I grew up in Plainfield, New Jersey, and he grew up in Freehold, New Jersey, not far from Asbury Park, I have an affinity towards him personally, but also I just love his music, and he really describes what it's like for people, particularly during the 1970s and 80s, when America was having this sort of devastating period of losing jobs. One of the great stories about Bruce Springsteen is when when Ronald Reagan tried to use his music to support his his campaign, and Bruce Springsteen said he objected to that, and he had to stop using "Born in the USA."
Well, I think that's, obviously I'm a kid from New Jersey as well, and Springsteen played in my high school gym in 1971. And, oftentimes politicians will take an artist's theme and use it, but it's cool to have the artists themselves having their own theme.
Yeah.
And I think Springsteen is one of those people that, Born in the USA is a very patriotic song, but when he, wrote about Nebraska, and he wrote about factories, and he wrote about the struggle, Allentown, and the change in demographics, the change in the economy. That also came from his heart.
Yeah. He was a working class kid,
right?
And he grew up understanding the struggles of ordinary people, losing their jobs, not being able to make ends meet. And that's all in his music. But what's great about Springsteen is that he had hope. Right. He always said we can move to a better place. Right. He saw himself as part of the tradition that began with Woody Guthrie, and he sang Woody Guthrie songs. Right. And he did an entire album about Tom Joad, the hero of The Grapes of Wrath. And so he really was somebody who inspired his audiences to think about the next phase of social justice, rather than to say things are hopeless and things can't get better.
And I think that's the theme of the book, at least to me, is that these are folks who had a perspective. Some of them were angry, some of them fought, some of them were cynical. Yeah. But the part of the progressive movement is that tomorrow is going to be better. I mean, it's about progress. It's about using the lessons of the past to make tomorrow better. And I think that's, to me, the overriding thing that you captured in your book, and that struggle continues today. I mean, we're on the eve of a presidential election year, and we're still seeing people fight over some of the legacies that are in your book. I mean, Margaret Sanger is one of the 100 people in here, and obviously Planned Parenthood is under siege today, and decades ago she had to modernize women's health, to modernize reproductive issues. That was a political perspective. So what drew you to her, and how do you see the relevance?
Margaret Sanger wanted to be a doctor, but back then it was hard for women to become doctors. She became a nurse. Right. And she saw the struggles that working class, mostly immigrant women had in New York, Jewish, Italian women, who had no control over their own bodies and were giving birth to babies they didn't want. And so she started the first birth control clinic in the United States in October of 1916 in Brooklyn.
Wow, 1916.
Right, and 9 days later she was arrested, and she was given a month in jail because she was breaking the law, because you were, not only was birth control information illegal to spread, but you couldn't clearly give abortions either. And so she was a courageous and pioneering figure. And later she started this organization called the Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood. And today, those issues are up front. Just a couple of weeks ago, Ted Cruz wrote a letter with 25 other Republicans in Congress demanding that Margaret Sanger's statue in the National Portrait Gallery in the Smithsonian be taken down because she shouldn't be a hero to anybody or a heroine to anybody. And Ben Carson attacked Margaret Sanger in a couple of speeches he gave because he accused her of being prejudiced against African Americans, which is a complete lie, which is not unusual for Ben Carson. So
well, it's cool that you are the defender of the legacy of the progressive movement, and that this book can be a tool. Now, do your students? How does that work? Do you have your students read this as well? I mean, you obviously use these lessons in your class.
This book is used in a lot of high school and college classes, and I use it in a class I teach on the history of social movements. But I make sure I give students back the 25 cents I get for every book.
So you can't profit from them.
Right, so I don't want to profit from making them read my own book. But it's a book that tells the stories of people who led movements and have had a huge impact on our life today. For example, one of the things I ask my students, particularly the women in my class, is how many of you played sports in high school or played sports now in college? And about 2/3 of the women students in my class say that they've played sports in high school or college. And I ask them, well, you know who Billie Jean King was? who's in my book, and hardly any of them know who Billie Jean King was. She was one of the leaders. She was not only a great athlete, a great tennis star, but she led the fight for Title IX, the federal law which requires colleges and universities to give equal funding for men and women's sports, and high schools as well. And so a lot of them are standing on the shoulders of people that they've never heard of, that they are benefiting from people. And I think it's important for today's generation to know who are the people that made their lives better, not only so they can hero worship, but also they can say, I can be like that too. These were ordinary people who did extraordinary things.
Right. And you talk a lot about how, I'm not going to do the quote justice, but how one person's struggle at a time becomes commonplace in the future, that movement makes a difference.
So think about the women's right to vote. 100 years ago, women's suffrage was a radical idea.
Right.
Social Security was a radical idea. It was first introduced into Congress in 1916 by a socialist congressman from Milwaukee named Victor Berger. It went nowhere, but 20 years later, Social Security became a controversial law that Franklin Roosevelt passed as part of the New Deal. And throughout the book, there are these
four-time elected president.
Yes. Right.
Franklin Roosevelt, most popular, arguably most popular populist president of all time.
Right. And a lot of the ideas that led to the New Deal were ideas that radicals had proposed years earlier. And so the theme of my book, as you were saying, is that the radical ideas of one generation are often the common sense of the next. And so I often ask my students and audiences that I'm giving talks, what are some of the things you'd like to see your grandchildren live as common sense that today might be considered radical? For example, 5 years ago, the idea of same-sex marriage was a radical idea. Even President Obama wouldn't support it. And now, 60% of all Americans think that same-sex marriage is something that should be legalized. And the next generation will take for granted, well, it won't even be a controversy that same-sex marriage is okay. So the ultra-right wing won't be able to use that as a wedge issue the way they've been doing the last 20 years.
What I find fascinating, I just did a presentation, changing a little bit the subject. I just did a presentation on Frank Lanterman, who was responsible for the Lanterman Act, and when he became an assembly member, there were 68,000 people with disabilities who were chained and incarcerated, and he found that outrageous, and he created and had no civil rights. And when he left office, there were 6,000, so he reduced it by 60,000 people. And in doing the research, there was no discussion of a social agenda. I mean, people didn't talk. The only conversation at the time was how do we pay for things. So a lot of the things that dominate the political discourse and the front page today, people weren't even concerned about. In sort of classic liberal versus conservative, it was really about funding. And not about all this other stuff that gets in the way. And I think that's what's great about your book is you sort of have 100 people who picked away at the issues of their time and either made a difference while they were alive or their legacy lasted beyond their time. Obviously, I'm partial to social workers. I had a number of social workers in my office when I was in office, and that was a movement and how we care for people that are detailed in here.
One of my favorite people in the book is a woman named Jane Addams. Jane Addams grew up in the late 1800s from a very wealthy family, and she was moved to help the poor by a visit she took to England with a friend of hers, where there was what was then called a settlement house, which today we would call community center. And the settlement house movement, which she found in the United States, started when she bought a home, a big mansion in an immigrant neighborhood in Chicago. It was called Hull House. And she brought some of her wealthy friends together. Most of them had gone to college. She was the first generation of American women to go to college. But she couldn't do most things because they were not letting women do most of the professions. And so she started her own profession called social work. And she basically opened up this house and had the immigrants come to this house, and she taught them English. She taught them how to apply to vote. She also organized them around labor unions. She helped to fight the corrupt politicians that were using bribes and so forth to stay in office. And Jane Addams was not only a social worker, she was a feminist, she was a pacifist, she was a labor activist. She was like a one-woman multicultural movement. And as a result of that, we have this profession that you and I have in our family of people that call themselves social workers, but she saw social work as a form of social reform.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, the book is The 100 Greatest Americans of the 20th Century. We're going to hear more when we come back on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino. We're back on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino talking to Professor Peter Dreier about the 100 most influential people in the 20th century. Peter, thanks again for being here.
Sure.
We have so many people to talk about. We haven't even talked about Jackie Robinson yet. So give us, you're a baseball fan. I mean, I see you on Facebook. You're constantly writing about baseball. Did it start with Jackie Robinson or the New York Giants?
It started with Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was a hero in my family, and not only because he was a great baseball player, and of course a great football player at UCLA as well, and a great track star as well. But he also used his fame as an athlete as a platform to speak out against social injustice. And at a time when most professional athletes, particularly baseball players, were basically intimidated or ignorant about talking about social justice and politics, Jackie Robinson was right out there. He had a column in the newspaper every week. He wrote a couple books. He gave speeches. He was on picket lines. He raised money for the NAACP during the heart of the civil rights era. So he was the Rookie of the Year. He was the most valuable player, but he was also a most valuable citizen as a great American. And when he was brought into baseball by Branch Rickey and for the Dodgers in 1947, it's hard for people today, because baseball was not as popular as it was back then, it's hard for people to imagine what a huge, huge influence that had on Americans in general, to say that the national pastime could now have its first black player. And he broke a lot of barriers, and he also kept speaking out about baseball. Even right before he died of diabetes in 1972, he was in his 50s, he still criticized baseball for not having enough black managers, for not having enough black coaches. So he was always on the front lines of social justice, and he's one of 3 athletes in my book. The other 2 were Muhammad Ali and Billie Jean King, and they all did the same thing. They used their sports fame to speak out as a platform about social issues.
And interestingly, I know in the case with Muhammad Ali, as he got older, he got less divisive as a figure. I mean, people rallied behind his message as he got. When he was brash and young, there were as many people who hated him for pushing that agenda as there were who embraced him. But I think so. That's the classic sort of theme of your book, is that time saw the special nature of the message.
Yeah, you know, when he refused to go to Vietnam, refused to get drafted, he was the heavyweight champion of the world.
Lost his title.
He lost his title. He lost millions of dollars in commercials and boxing fees, and yet he did it because of his conscience. And then, as you said, later he became kind of a revered public figure. That great iconic moment when he lit the torch for the Olympics was a moment where people forgot all about the controversy, and they just thought of him as a human rights activist. They forgot about him as a boxer.
Right. And he's the most recognizable person in the world.
Absolutely.
From what I've read about. You know, everybody knows his iconic image. And I think that's the beauty of what you were talking about. It's people that many of these people we know because we welcomed into our living room through the television. But like Jackie Robinson, there was a second piece to his life. Obviously, California raised product, and in Pasadena, the statues of Jackie and Mac Robinson adorn City Hall, and a revered character. His sister-in-law actually still, Mac's wife is still active.
Dell.
She's awesome, and still wears Jackie's jacket when she goes to events.
42.
Interestingly, years ago I met a gentleman named Percy Ricks, who was the first African-American sergeant in the military put over white troops. And it was an experiment that the military did at the time, and they actually brought Jackie Robinson to meet with him. And I have the photos of that
great.
meeting.
Oh,
I actually have the original military photos of that
great.
meeting of the first African-American sergeant put over white troops. And at the time, there's a manual that came out that said the Army was not an instrument of social change. So here you have the official branch of the U.S. government declaring that it's not, social change is not a role for it to play. At a time when we needed social change and we needed the activists that you detail in your book, and Jackie Robinson being one of those activists. We haven't talked about my favorite politician, Fiorello LaGuardia. Tell us about the Little Flower, which was his nickname.
LaGuardia was a great figure. He was the mayor of New York during the Depression. And he said to Franklin Roosevelt, use New York as a laboratory for the New Deal. And so as a result of that, LaGuardia got millions and millions of dollars for parks, for playgrounds, for health clinics, for public housing, for parks and schools. And he really was kind of the incubator of the New Deal. And he was the leader of urban America. He helped to basically teach America about the wonderful things that cities bring to our country. But on top of that, he was an incredible, colorful character.
That's why I like him.
And yes, I mean, you have a lot in common with him, obviously. And one of the things he did that, you know, is a great story is that during the Depression, the New York newspapers went on strike. The newspaper workers went on strike. And it deprived all the children and adults in New York of being able to read the funny papers, the cartoons.
So they called them on the East Coast. They weren't called comics. They were called the funny papers.
So LaGuardia got on the radio and he read the funny papers. He read the cartoons. He read the comics to the children of New York City. And that was the kind of person he was. He wasn't, you know, he didn't see that as beneath him. He saw that as something where he could communicate to the people. So he had his own version of what Roosevelt called the fireside chats, where he would talk, Roosevelt would talk to the public, except for LaGuardia, it was talking about Dick Tracy and the other cartoon figures.
Well, he didn't want to deprive the kids of what their Sunday papers had. And again, back then, the Sunday papers had a whole insert of the comics.
That's right.
And families would sit around and read them. Of course, a lot of people today just know the name from the airport.
And LaGuardia Airport.
LaGuardia Airport, but that's, you know, the legacy of the book.
A great mayor, a great mayor.
And made New York what it is today.
I worked for a mayor for many years. I worked for Ray Flynn, who was the mayor of Boston. And, you know, Flynn was Irish and LaGuardia was Italian, although he was half Jewish.
He spoke Yiddish fluently.
Half Catholic. He was raised Episcopalian. He spoke 7 languages, including Italian, English, and Yiddish. He ran on both the Republican Party and the Labor Party. So he was a colorful figure, but you know, he was also a great administrator. People don't remember that New York was a corrupt city before he took over, and he cleaned up the corruption in New York. So he was you know, it's a good person for you to model yourself on.
Absolutely. No. Well, you know, I'm drawn to the populace, you know, and he had that spark, and I think authenticity. I mean,
that's right.
You know, he himself loved the comics, so it wasn't a stretch to read the comics. I mean, you know, I always say what a lot of times politicians where they get in trouble is where they try to be something they're not, and if you could just be who you are,
that's right,
the better than anybody else.
And he loved people. He loved going off and talking to people on the streets in New York.
Now, again, early on you talked about the different types of people in the book, the political leaders, the artistic leaders. Upton Sinclair is somebody that you like and revere and write about extensively in the book.
So Upton Sinclair is most famous for writing a novel called The Jungle, which exposed the awful working conditions in the meatpacking plants of Chicago. It was a novel, but he saw himself as part of this tradition called muckraking, of exposing injustice. And it was written in 1906. And it became a bestseller. And as a result of that book, people all over the country began to think twice about the food they were eating, because they realized that the food they were eating was being produced in ways that were quite dangerous. For example, you know, a lot of workers would lose their fingers, and that those fingers would wind up in your hamburgers and hot dogs. And so it caused a huge public outrage about the
new system of measurement, the digit.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So as a result of that, Theodore Roosevelt was also in my book. President Roosevelt read that book and shared the outrage with lots of other people about the conditions of our food, and passed 2 laws, the Meat Inspection Act and the Food and Drug Act. And today we have an agency called the Food and Drug Administration, which is supposed to monitor the health and safety of our food. We have Upton Sinclair to thank for the Food and Drug Administration, which is an incredible agency which has kept millions of people alive and from getting infectious diseases and being poisoned by food. But
so that's a controversial theory that an author can save lives. Imagine that. The written word has a living legacy.
Absolutely. And then he moved to Pasadena.
Right. All roads lead to Pasadena.
Right. And in 1934, he was a socialist. And he'd run for a couple of offices as a socialist, and he didn't get anywhere. And then he said, well, maybe I'll try being a Democrat. So he ran for governor of California in 1934, and he wrote a little pamphlet called I, Governor of California, and How I Solve Poverty in California. And it became a bestseller. His campaign took off way beyond what he thought it was. He was kind of like Bernie Sanders in that way.
Right.
Bernie Sanders didn't think he was going to be a serious candidate. Now he is. So he won the Democratic Party nomination for governor in 1934. And then all the business leaders in California, the agricultural industry and the LA Times and others, they all ganged up against him, and he lost the election. But a lot of the ideas that he espoused in his election and in this little pamphlet, the 8-hour day, the minimum wage, things like that, were things that later Franklin Roosevelt thought he had to do to appease the progressive movement that had helped him get elected. And so Upton Sinclair moved the agenda, even though he didn't get elected.
Right, and I often say that the role of the activist today is to make the politician do better. If you're moving the agenda, you don't have to be the person who actually votes on it.
That's right.
But you can be the influencer of what gets done. And I think that's, a lot of young people, you and I both, you teach on a college campus, I'm a fellow at SC, we're around young people a lot, and I see 2 kinds. Some that understand you don't have to be the person in the front to make a difference, and others that feel you have to be, and we need both.
Right.
And it's a combination of the people pushing and the people who get to push the right button at the right time.
I imagine that at least half the people that I write about in this book are people that most people have never heard of.
Right.
But should hear about, which is why they should read the book. But more than that, these are people that made a huge difference. And just like my students have never heard of Billie Jean King, she was a huge influence in our society.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, the Bobby Riggs, Billie Jean King tennis match was probably one of the most watched television sporting events of all time. And Billie Jean King won. One of the things, obviously we're talking about change and progress. People sometimes have a very simplistic view of the world. Government intervention, no government intervention. And I always use the seatbelt as he said. Don't you feel better that you have a seatbelt?
Absolutely.
But somebody had to pass a law that said you needed a seatbelt.
That's right. And one of the people in my book is Ralph Nader.
Right.
Who is more responsible for auto safety and consumer protection than anyone else. My students today, they think of Ralph Nader, he's that guy that runs for president all the time and loses, and he's kind of a crank. Right, and unfortunately, I think on his tombstone, it's going to say he's the guy that made sure that George Bush was elected because he ran against Al Gore and stole some of those votes away from him. But the legacy that he really leaves us is OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and consumer protection laws.
Shatterproof glass, seat belts, car seats, all those things that we take commonplace in our average family life today. Needed an advocate.
When you go to the airport and they have too many people on the plane, and they say, does anybody want to give up their seat, and in exchange for that, we will give you a couple $100 for and another flight. That was Ralph Nader.
Right.
He made them do that.
Right. All those things that again are common today were radical in the 1960s.
That's right.
It's just fascinating stuff. I wish we could continue. We've only talked about 25 of the 100, but there are gems about each of them and a movement attached with each of the people. I highly recommend the 100 greatest Americans of the 20th century, and think about it. Think about the things that when you fly into LaGuardia Airport, why is it there? Think about the social justice, the 8-hour workday, I think, is a critical component of society. The 40-hour work week, overtime.
Right.
All of those things had to start somewhere with an average American with a passion for social justice. His name is Peter Dreier. He's one of those people. Thank you for joining us on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.